Welcome to our budget special on Pathbreakers. I'm Neha Bothra. My guest today is Jayant Sinha. He heads the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance and was the Minister of State for Civil Aviation and Finance. Over the past 1 decade or so, he's played a critical role when it comes to path-breaking reforms. Take the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code, the National Infrastructure Investment Fund, Uran scheme, privatization of Air India and airports, more recently the Digital Competition Bill and the Vyapar credit card, for example. Today we'll talk about the state of the economy and what it will take for Budget 2023 to bring the Indian economy back on the high growth track. Stay tuned to Pathbreakers. Thank you so much for joining us on Pathbreakers. I'm very grateful for your time.
You're very welcome. Namaskar, Neha ji.
Let me start by talking a bit about the economy. We stand at a very interesting juncture. India is said to be the fastest growing major economy in the world, and simultaneously we have the World Bank and the IMF talking about a global recession. How do you see India placed? Of course, we aren't insulated, but to what extent can we really be impacted by it?
So Neha ji, India is today a shining star in the global economy. And if you look at all of India's macroeconomic parameters, and those include inflation, growth, current account deficit, fiscal deficit, and compare that to other major economies in the world, we are doing far, far better. The only other major economy that's growing faster than India is Saudi Arabia. And the reason they're growing so quickly is because oil prices have gone up, and they're largely an oil-driven economy. So apart from Saudi Arabia, India is doing better virtually than every other major economy. We have done extraordinarily well this year. We will end this year, I think, with a GDP growth rate of close to 7%, which is what the advanced estimates are also telling us. And the predictions are that next year, the economy is going to grow anywhere between 6 to 7%. I mean, obviously, it's a year away, so forecasts tend to be a little bit more wider when you look at next year. And that uncertainty is largely because the global economy is slowing rapidly right now because of the central bank tightening cycle that's happening. As you know, the US Fed has raised rates dramatically, the European Central Bank has raised rates, even the Japanese Central Bank is starting to raise rates right now. And that's because inflation in the OECD, in the developed economies, has risen very sharply and is at levels that have not been seen in 40 years. So there is a very, very dramatic central bank tightening cycle that's happening right now, deliberately being done to slow down the developed economies around the world. And as they go into, this massive slowdown and an outright recession, we are likely to see a slowdown in the global economy, which of course will spill over into India. So that's what we need to worry about next year. But as far as India is concerned and our macroeconomic parameters are concerned and our economic management is concerned, we are really a shining star.
In fact, coming out of the pandemic, the government has been doing all it can to spurt investments to boost growth. Do you think there's been a meaningful uptake when it comes to investments?
Everybody believes that the way we handled the COVID slowdown was absolutely outstanding. And the calibrated, prudent response that we used, we did not overstimulate the economy, yet we were able to provide, and I give full credit to the Honorable Prime Minister, the Honorable Finance Minister, and all of the cabinet to directing the aid to the most vulnerable populations. And so with the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, which ran for 2.5 years, where we put a lot of money into the food grains distribution program, and we were able to support vulnerable populations, which effectively was almost like a direct cash transfer, because obviously it prevented them and they didn't have to spend that kind of money on food grains. Then we continued to provide very high fertilizer subsidy, even though fertilizer prices went up, and Kisan Samman Nidhi was there as well, which provided 6,000 rupees to farmers. So support to the vulnerable populations, also through NREGA payments and free vaccines, was fully there. So very calibrated, very prudent response there. At the same time, for MSMEs, we provided the ECLGS scheme. So they were provided a waiver in terms of their loans and in terms of their interest payments. And so we were able to get them through the COVID pandemic as well. Despite oil prices going up, oil prices went up dramatically from $40, $50, $60 a barrel to close to $80, $120 a barrel. And of course, we are a huge oil importer. So inflation could have skyrocketed. Inflation could have hit double digits, which is what happened post the global financial crisis during the UPA time. Despite this very major shock to commodity prices, our inflation has stayed very much under control because the government again very thoughtfully started to remove some of the excise taxes on fuels, and so our inflation went up, but it remained in the 6% range, 6.5% range. Whereas if you look at the OECD economies, their inflation reached 8, 9, 10%, levels they've never seen. So this shows you that between our fiscal policies to support vulnerable populations and our monetary policies to keep inflation under control, all of that was so deftly managed that now we are moving into the growth phase in a very robust way, definitely on the front foot. And here I'll come to the point that you mentioned, Neha, which is capital expenditure. So for us to boost growth, to grow jobs, to move towards prosperity, investment is crucial. Here, while private sector capex was a little depressed because of the COVID pandemic and the lockdown, the government stepped up public capex, right, by almost 2 percentage points of GDP, which is an enormous amount, 4-5 lakh crores. Plus a lakh crores was provided to the states to be able to do their capex. So we really pushed hard on the public capex part, and we really demonstrated that. And now what's happening is, because consumption is coming back up again, because there's been good public capex, good building up of infrastructure such as roads, highways, airports, etc., private sector capex is now coming in, and we are seeing the private sector capex cycle take off.
Mm-hmm. You know, touching upon the consumption part of it, most managements of FMCG companies have been a little cautious in their outlook when it comes to rural demand. In fact, rural distress is something that they have highlighted over the past few quarters. Where do you think the pain point is in the rural economy? Because it forms a major function when it comes to consumption, the consumption engine that you spoke about.
No, you're absolutely right, Neha. So obviously, if you look at agriculture is a much smaller part of the economy right now. It's maybe 15, 16, 18%, somewhere in that range. But most of our population, 60-70% of our population, is still in rural areas. It's not in the cities. Now in rural areas, of course, there are not just agricultural sources of income, but other sources of income as well. But nevertheless, it's still a rural population, and rural consumption therefore becomes very important for the economy, even as agriculture has become less important. So there, obviously, we need to see growth happening in terms of government spending. We need to see growth happening in terms of agri processing, and we need to see growth happening in more rural industries as well. As that happens, and we continue to provide the support through NREGA, rural consumption will pick up, and of course that will then result in a durable consumption boom.
Mm-hmm. The government has been spending a lot when it comes to social and other welfare schemes. In fact, I think the subsidy bill of the government has already crossed 95% of the allotted amount for the whole year as of November. Keeping all of these expenses in mind, on the revenue front, when we talk of social welfare, we talk of subsidies, you spoke about capital expenditure as well, about how the government needs to actually focus on that to drive growth in the coming years. Do you think that this budget is going to be a very delicate balancing act? All budgets are, I agree, but this year is going to be especially harder given the economic backdrop, the global economy, and also the fact that the government doesn't really have that much room in terms of increasing expenditure.
So budgets are always a balancing act, and the question always is how fine a balance do you strike? So I think this time, from an economic perspective, the Honorable Finance Minister is going in very much on the front foot. The economy is doing well. It's clear what our priorities should be. I think we all agree on what the priorities should be. So I think she's very much on the front foot. The government is very much on the front foot. However, the complication this year is really, Neha-ji, because of three factors. One, it is of course towards the end of the electoral cycle. So we are going into the election season and so on. And so obviously there has to be something there that will excite people, that will stimulate further growth and get people feeling even more confident about the economy. So that's one complicating factor. The second complicating factor I've already addressed, which is the slowdown that's happening in the global economy because, of course, of the central bank tightening cycle. And the third is the high level of uncertainty that we are dealing with because of certain geopolitical factors as well. And that high level of uncertainty deals with, of course, the war in Ukraine that is going on right now, the lockdown and the way in which China is dealing with the COVID pandemic, and the sharp turn towards protectionism that we are seeing around the world. So all of these geopolitical factors are a big uncertainty right now for India and the global economy. So again, there's three factors. That's where the complications are. But as far as India's economy is concerned and the budget is concerned, I think the government's done a wonderful job.
True, but going ahead, if you look at government debt and the fact that it's putting pressure on bond yields, and that will of course increase the funding costs, and which will then actually have the negative role of crowding out private investment. The government debt GDP ratio, which is now close to 85%. Ideally, we'd want it at 60%. So all these factors make it more challenging for the finance minister this year.
It was important to support vulnerable people then, and that's why, of course, the fiscal deficit went up and the debt to GDP went up as well. Now, the Honorable Finance Minister, the Honorable Prime Minister have been very clear that we are on a fiscal consolidation path. Fiscal consolidation will happen, and debt to GDP and, of course, the fiscal deficit, all of those will come down. So, yes, in that sense, you have to be prudent. But at the same time, remember, the economy is growing strongly and tax revenues have been buoyant. So there is room there fiscally as well to be able to undertake certain actions. Now, of course, we come back to the balancing act, which is, what are your priorities going to be? How are you going to make certain trade-offs? That you have to consider. And of course, as I said, because of the uncertainties and because of the electoral cycle, that is where you'll have to make those decisions.
To your mind, the finance minister would need to prioritize spending over fiscal prudence?
I think the fiscal consolidation path has been laid out, so you will have to operate within that framework for sure. Now, within the framework, of course, as I have said, there are trade-offs. But again, there are, I think, as the Honorable Finance Minister and the Honorable Prime Minister have indicated, 5 priorities that they will be deciding amongst, right? So the first priority, of course, has to be macroeconomic stability, which since 2014 we've done a brilliant job in terms of macroeconomic stability, going from being one of the fragile 5 to being a shining star. So just see what has happened over the last 8 or 9 years. India was a fragile 5 country, during the UPA years, and now during Pradhan Mantri Modi ji's years, we have become a shining star. So that is because of macroeconomic stability, and that's the first priority. Second priority, to your point, is fiscal consolidation. Third priority is continued support for vulnerable populations, so that we can get them through these difficult, challenging times. Number 4, of course, is stimulating capex. Public capex has already happened. Now we've got to get private capex because that drives long-term growth. And number 5 is really positioning the economy for the future, which is where the PLI schemes, where the support for the green hydrogen mission, all of these come into play. I think these are the 5 priorities that the Honorable Finance Minister, the Honorable Prime Minister have indicated. And now the question will be the trade-offs that they make for the budget.
We'll touch on some of these points in detail, but first let me come back to the revenue part. So let me talk a bit about the GST, which has been the money machine really for the government. Last 2 years, the government has overshot what it estimated to get on the revenue front. Earlier it used to overestimate, now it underestimates it. How do you think the government should look at tax receivables in the current situation, where there may be a slight economic slowdown as well, as many economists are cautious of?
Neha ji, we've gone through a very turbulent and unpredictable phase of sort of economic circumstances and situations. So during this time, not just our government, but virtually every government, every economic forecaster has found it very difficult to predict what's going to happen. How big is the impact of COVID going to be? How quickly are we going to recover? What is the level of economic scarring? Been very difficult for anybody to figure this out because we've been in unprecedented times. There are no models that can tell you what are going to happen at this time. So that's why I think it's been difficult to pin down certain numbers. That being said, it's very clear through the GST numbers, and not just in nominal terms. We are getting 1.4 lakh crores, 1.5 lakh crores a month now, so we are doing very well in absolute nominal numbers. But even as a percent of GDP, if you look at GST collections, they have been quite strong and they have been going up. And that's happening because of compliance and further formalization of the economy. So there are structural forces also happening in the economy which are strengthening our economy and making it better and more productive in the long run. We have a absolutely world-leading GST system, which has taken us many years to put in place, stabilize, and get everybody comfortable with. But I can tell you the tax reform that we undertook, and I was part of it to some extent, going from 37 different indirect taxes to one single indirect tax framework, and then pooling sovereign taxing powers between the center and the states into the GST Council, establishing a good set of rates for all the goods and services in the economy. I mean, this is an epic set of reforms, So it's a matter of great satisfaction for all of us who've been involved in it to see that it has stabilized so well and that it is growing in such a robust manner. So GST is doing extraordinarily well, and of course, even if you look at direct taxes, not just indirect taxes, they are also doing well for the same reasons that I mentioned, formalization as well as better compliance. So our tax to GDP ratio is also increasing as a result of that.
The salaried class always complains for years now that the budget hasn't really done much for them and they are taken for granted. What do you think is a specific remedy for what the salaried class feels in terms of tax reforms or anything that can elevate the pain of the salaried class to some extent?
So the most important thing for the salaried class, because every time around the budget you hear the same complaints, is growth and jobs and the economy doing well. Because you always talk about taxes, but first we have to look at your incomes, right? So your income is protected from inflation because inflation rates have been low, and on a real basis people are progressing, they're improving, they're getting better jobs. So income has been strong. That's very important. Now as far as taxes are concerned, the Honorable Finance Minister over a period of time has been simplifying, streamlining, providing lots of ways in which you can get to a very simple and clear tax structure. Now, can we provide further relief to middle class taxpayers? That's a decision that the Honorable Prime Minister and the Honorable Finance Minister will take.
Another very interesting area is disinvestment. It's been years, the government comes out with a target, and now critics love to say that it's a balancing number for the government because it's failed to meet its targets. Given your work in that area, how do you think the government actually derives the disinvestment target?
So on disinvestments, it's damned if I do, damned if I don't, right? So if you don't have a target and you don't work towards it, people say you don't have a target. Then if you're not able to achieve it because of market circumstances, then again you're blamed for it. But I guess that's why we do what we do. But disinvestment is done in a very sincere way. And clearly there is a national monetization pipeline that gets created, and on the basis of the national monetization pipeline, the DIPAM secretary sits down, they think through what's possible, and then they put out their forecast. Obviously that is subject to very significant uncertainty because who can predict markets, Neha ji? So nobody can predict markets, nobody knows where markets are going to go on a year-to-year basis, and as a result of that it becomes sometimes difficult to predict whether disinvestment will happen or not. But because we broadened the scope, we've thought about the national monetization pipeline, we've included in it not just companies but real estate and other types of assets. I think because we have a more diversified set of monetization measures, hopefully we'll have more predictability going forward.
Most of the low-hanging fruits have been taken by the government, and now you have more difficult targets that the government wants to monetize.
I don't think I would agree with that, Neha ji, because the most difficult one was Air India, which we got done, and there were significant policy innovations and significant important decisions that had to be made to allow Air India to happen. And now that Air India has happened, and I'll just tell you the 3 things that we did in Air India that are genuine innovations that will help dramatically in the future as well. So I think we've got one of the most difficult disinvestments done. The ones coming after this are going to be, I think, very much more expedited as a result of that. So 3 things we did in Air India that are genuinely groundbreaking, massive reforms that people need to understand. Number 1 is that we separated the productive operating assets from the non-productive operating assets. So by creating Air India, the airline, and taking all of the other assets that were not easily monetizable like real estate, like some of the other companies, their art collection, and putting it into the Air India SPV, we separated the good Air India from the bad Air India. Just like you do a good bank and a bad bank. That's where the idea came from. So That was a very important innovation as far as Air India is concerned. The second very important innovation is bidding on enterprise value, not on equity value. So the bidding parameter became enterprise value. The moment you go to enterprise value, you enable bidders to decide how much debt they want to take on as well. So they're not just bidding for equity, they're bidding for equity plus debt, which is equal to enterprise value. And in doing so, they can also decide how much debt they want to take on. That was a huge, huge innovation, and that will allow us to do a lot more disinvestment going forward. And the third was, we put in place appropriate protections for all of the employees of Air India. And by putting in place the appropriate protections and by securing their future, it became very possible for us to get their support and cooperation as well. So we had all the unions on board, we separated out the good assets from the bad assets, and we were able to bid on an enterprise value basis. These are three profound innovations that are going to shape disinvestment in India for decades to come.
Speaking of disinvestments, the Niti Aayog has come out with recommendations on privatizing public sector banks. It's not new. Last 2-3 years, we've been hearing a lot about it specifically. Some big names are in discussion. Of course, privatizing many of these public sector banks brings about better governance, accountability. How practical is it in terms of implementation?
The IDBI bank privatization process is underway. And the DIPAM secretary has indicated that the response for that has been very, very strong. So clearly there are many, many buyers that are interested in acquiring a public sector bank and growing it and scaling it up. And we obviously have the example of Axis Bank, which has done extraordinarily well after it was spun out from UTI. So there's a great deal of interest in India's financial services sector. It's a sector that's created tremendous value for shareholders. That's why it's very attractive for buyers, and I think IDBI will proceed quite well. Beyond that, of course, because we are going into an election period, and we'll have to see how it sort of unfolds after that. But I think IDBI will be a very good test of what's possible as far as the marketplace is concerned. So in that sense, our public sector banks can truly do a splendid job once they're freed up to compete.
What about financial inclusion? That is something that public sector banks have been chasing quite closely, be it the Jan Dhan accounts, for example.
Now, when it comes to all of the financial inclusion work, remember that the Reserve Bank of India, through various policy instruments like priority sector lending, can make it possible for both public sector and private sector banks to deal with financial inclusion. The RBI has the powers to do that. So it actually doesn't matter whether you're owned by the public, that is your publicly owned bank, or you're owned through the capital markets as a private sector bank. All types of banks can participate in financial inclusion. And then there are other types of banks as well, like payment banks and so on, that RBI has licensed. And through them also we can have financial inclusion. So the RBI is very focused on financial inclusion, and we've done an extraordinary job, for example, through Jan Dhan, to bring 100% banking to everybody.
You touched upon some very interesting points earlier. One was manufacturing. The government has been doing a lot to boost manufacturing, PLI schemes and whatnot. There is one faction that has been critical of PLI schemes, and they feel it's not the best means to boost manufacturing. What are your views in this regard?
I think the PLI scheme has been wonderful, and it's absolutely clear when you look at the data that investments have come in and manufacturing volumes have gone up. I mean, the poster child for all of this is what's happened with smartphones. In 2014, there were no smartphones being made in India, none whatsoever. And now we have lakhs and lakhs, crores of smartphones. I think the total number is some 20 crore smartphones that are being made in India. And we have Apple thinking of moving a tremendous amount of its smartphone production to India. The Tatas are in discussion to really scale that up as well. We have Foxconn, we have Pegatron, all of these operating in India as well. So that tells you that with the right kind of policies, even a high-end manufacturing product like smartphones can come to India, be successfully manufactured in India and exported from India as well. So we have to absolutely encourage manufacturing, and smartphones and other such industries have done really, really well. Even as we recognize that manufacturing can come to India and be scaled up, it's equally important to recognize that for the industries of the future, batteries, semiconductors, solar panels, that unless we have the right kind of industrial policy and we change the competitive disadvantage that manufacturers have in India right now, we are not going to be able to scale up. And you can talk about a perfect free market, global trade, on a level playing field, but we recognize that that's not the world we live in. The world we live in is a world where there are countries practicing mercantilist industrial policies, where deglobalization and a fragmentation of supply chains is happening. Under these circumstances, whether it's electronics, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's defense production, whether it is renewable energy, it's very important for India to be able to have a sufficient manufacturing base and to be integrated in global supply chains. That will require industrial policy, that will require incentives. That is the geopolitical environment that we're living in. Now, obviously some people can talk about whether this policy can be improved, it can be tweaked, it can be strengthened, and all of those are absolutely fair, and the government is listening to all of those and working closely with industry to improve upon that. But I don't think anybody today can question that we need industrial policy. Even the bastion of free market thought, the United States, has just put in an Inflation Reduction Act where they're spending $370 billion on strengthening renewables, batteries, etc. And they have a separate act called the CHIPS Act, where they are trying to bring semiconductor production back to the United States. So even the bastion of free market thought is doing the equivalent of PLI. So those people who are criticizing it, I think, are misguided.
Sir, given your wide range of experience, how, at a personal level, would you say are the top 3 critical areas that you would want the government to address in the upcoming budget?
Climate change is an existentialist crisis for India, for South Asia, for the planet. So we need to do a tremendous amount as far as climate change is concerned, so that we can ensure that our people can prosper and live in a world which is not being racked by the negative impact of climate change. We saw what the floods in Pakistan did. They set back economic development in Pakistan by many years. And so we don't want that kind of impact due to climate change in India. So we have to have adaptation measures, mitigation measures, resilience measures. So climate change is a longer term and a very important priority for us. Number two, I think, is we have to invest massively more in human capital. Whether it's education, whether it's nutrition, whether it is higher education, in all of these dimensions, we've got to invest massively in human capital so our people are productive and skilled and they can compete in the global economy. So a third priority for me would be to drive our innovation ecosystem, to drive our startup ecosystem, because we need a continuous sort of flow of innovations, continuous flow of excellent startups that will enable us to drive our economy forward. So for me, personally speaking, these are the top 3 priorities.
Do you miss not having an executive role?
I love the work that I do, and I'm very pleased to be able to contribute through the work I'm doing in the Standing Committee and in Parliament.
You have a wide experience when it comes to the entire process of policy making, starting from your stint in the Finance Ministry, the Civil Aviation Ministry. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I've been very, very privileged and fortunate that I've got these responsibilities from the party, which is first to be in the Ministry of Finance for 2 years and really understand how that works and how the budget making process works. And then 3 years in a very important sunrise sector, which is aviation, where we formulated some absolutely game-changing policies. For example, on Udan, which is the Ude Desh Ka Aam Nagrik, where we've opened up so many airports, Air India and airport privatization, Digi Yatra, which is being rolled out right now, the work that we've did to make our whole aviation system much, much safer, because we've now been upgraded by the FAA, one of the safest aviation systems in the world. And we also dealt, you may not believe this, but we also dealt at length with the issue of unruly passengers, which has been much in the news right now. So we have a very clear set of policies on unruly passengers, which I do wish were fully implemented, because I think that would stop this kind of behavior that we are seeing, which is absolutely unconscionable. So tremendous learnings, both in the Ministry of Finance and the Aviation Ministry. But now this is a very interesting and very influential set of policy activities that we are undertaking through the Standing Committee on Finance, where we are working in detail on legislation, on important new policy areas for the government. So it's been an extraordinary learning experience, and I must add that it has been my extraordinary privilege to learn from outstanding, sort of leaders such as obviously the Honorable Prime Minister, the Honorable Finance Minister, the previous Honorable Finance Minister Shri Arun Jaitley ji, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who's the former Prime Minister of India, who's a member of the Standing Committee on Finance, Shri Chidambaram Sahab, who's now a member of the Finance Committee. So we have such a tremendous set of senior, experienced, wise people that are in the Standing Committee, that it's an extraordinary learning opportunity. For me, from a growth and a learning perspective, it's been fantastic.
Where would you want these learning experiences to lead you?
That the nation will decide, the party will decide. I am here to serve the nation.
I'll touch upon three very path-breaking reforms that you have played a very important role in. Let's start with the insolvency code. It's absolutely revamped the way the banking sector works. It's unlocked a lot of efficiency in the sector. Do you think more needs to be done?
I was very fortunate to have piloted the legislation in the insolvency and bankruptcy code, and then thereafter in the Standing Committee to have worked on many amendments to it as we've learned in practice what is happening. So we now have a fairly robust bankruptcy code in India that is absolutely at a world-class level. We still have a lot of work to do to bring it to a world-leading level, but it is world-class. And that was also demonstrated in the rankings that were done by the World Bank and elsewhere, and the recovery processes that are happening right now. But yes, we need to continue to improve it. One of the most important things we need to do is to increase capacity in the system. So we need more, judges on the NCLT benches. We need more NCLT benches. We need to increase capacity also among the resolution professionals and so on. So second, we need, I think, a code of conduct for creditors to be disciplined in the way they operate, etc. Number three, I think as far as the process itself is concerned, the process needs to be very well defined. The rules of the game are still not crystal clear in many instances. The rules of the game have to be decided. Then there are issues associated with pre-packaged bankruptcy and international bankruptcies. Those also have to be further defined and improved. But policy making is a continuous process, Neha ji. As markets evolve, players evolve, they understand new things, they start to use certain loopholes. Policy making and the legislative framework also has to evolve. So it's a continuous process.
Take the new economy, for example. It's throwing up new challenges and really giving new areas for discussion. Some of these you've tried to address recently.
Yes, so thank you for asking about that, Neha ji. So the work that we have done in both the amendments to the competition bill as it stands right now, and we've had a set of amendments that have come after 15 years, Neha ji. So this has been a very important set of amendments to the competition bill. And then of course we've proposed a Digital Competition Act. So I think what this will do is between the amendments to the competition bill and the Digital Competition Act, together they will formulate for India for the next decade a very powerful competition law and a framework that is absolutely world leading. And the aspects, as you said, about new age markets and so on, are well addressed both in the competition amendment bill for ex post anti-competitive behavior. So through the deal value threshold, that will bring a lot of mergers within the purview of examination, which was not the case, through the settlement and commitment process. So in both those ways, there will be an opportunity to address new age markets. But importantly, through the Digital Competition Bill, where you will look at ex-ante regulation of anti-competitive practices, which is now something that around the world people are recognizing has to be dealt with. Those are issues that do need to be examined.
Mm-hmm. So in your role as the chairperson of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance, what are some areas that you want to look deeper into and contribute towards in terms of strengthening the framework?
So honourable members have brought up several topics that hopefully we will work through this year. One, of course, has to deal with cybercrime. So these loan apps that are out there, there's been a lot of cyber crime that has happened. There are issues around cyber security. Particularly for the financial sector, that is something that's extremely important, and that we need to make sure that we are absolutely world leading in that regard. A second area that's come up is strengthening the regulatory capacity that we have across a wide range of our regulators, which of course include the work we've been doing with the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board, the Competition Commission of India, NCLT, obviously with SEBI, with RBI. So we need to make sure that our regulators have the capacity and the capabilities to be able to deal with a $10 trillion globally sophisticated economy. So we are well on the path towards being the third largest economy on the planet and open economy, unlike China, which is a very closed economy. And that means that we have to be able to have regulators that are world leading as well. And number three area which we've also started to look at is how do we ensure enough investment for sustainable growth. So again, as I said, because of climate change, all the indications are we've got to double private sector capex. So how do we ensure that we can double private sector capex?
The banking regulator specifically, it has the very important role of ensuring that inflation is stable at 4% plus or minus 2%. Do you think that it should have the additional role of being a public debt manager?
So that is an issue that has been examined and discussed, at great length, and there are various different views on that. So it has not come up before the committee yet, and we haven't examined it. So at this stage, I wouldn't say that we have an opinion on that.
Sir, thank you so much for your time. I'm very grateful you took out time and shared your views and perspective on a whole range of issues. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, Neha ji. Thank you very much for having me on your show.